So there are three kind of market forces we wanted to touch on during our conversation today, and these are really things that we've seen firsthand over the last year or so in the U.S. So the first of those that we'll take a look at is really the drug development pipeline and how increasingly that leverages cold chain. The next will be kind of the reshoring of a lot of U.S. pharmaceutical manufacturing, and how that's turning into a lot of CapEx investments and new projects that I'm sure everybody sees the headlines and experiences, kind of day to day in a PR sense, but is becoming real in a number of projects and will continue to do so. And then lastly, talking about technology and how that plays into the compliance model and the pharma requirements of today. And that isn't just AI, it's technology in general and how that plays into any number of different use cases, from how we collect data, how that data is managed, how that makes it off-site in many cases. We're still coming from on-prem environments in a lot of ways. So we'll dive into technology last to wrap us up today. All right, so first here, we wanted to spend some time looking at the new drug pipeline and how it's rewriting cold chain requirements. So if we look at the world today in terms of the pharmaceutical pipeline and new things coming to the market, we're at this really cool inflection point where more than 50% of the new pipeline of drugs being developed fit into a space that largely requires temperature compliance, and in many cases, cold chain and a number of kind of varying cold requirements throughout production. And so we see this, come up again and again in a variety of circumstances. But if today's pipeline is tomorrow's reality, right, we're going to see this across the board in everyone from the bigger names that Adam mentioned before into CDMOs and some of these smaller labs. So Adam, you maybe want to talk about, kind of maybe some of the smaller use cases and, how we think about just being agile with some of the CDMOs or laboratories that maybe haven't had their stories big and blown up on slide 2 that we walked through.
To me, it's pretty clear when I just walk through our customer relationship database and look into these numbers with how many biologics and GLP-1 products and cell and gene products that are being developed right now. Our pipeline of companies within that industry kind of segmentation is overwhelming. So I think it's pretty clear from our vantage point. Again, with the fingertips on the boiling plate here, that's a new one, but that we feel it, we see it in data, we see it in the market trends, but we can also feel it that these companies, small, medium size, they're growing at a pace that is quite insane. And when you look at their supply chains, both on after production, but also before production, when you have a kind of a new segment that is growing so much, and you have and they're small and they're everywhere, they're distributed in all the bigger clusters in pharma. We decided to put our flagpole down in North Carolina because there is an oversaturation of pharmaceutical production down here. And so you really feel it, but it's also affecting the supply chain on before on the API side, but also on the post part of it. So you can also sense it in the logistical side, where the requirements for logistics and storage and distribution companies are getting affected by this amount of new types of companies doing cell and genes, GLP-1s, etc., and biologics, that they need new ways of handling their goods. That is also affecting their business models, which is so. I think basically what I'm telling is just we sense it all around, that it's kind of like it's boiling in all these kind of pockets.
And I think this next number kind of blew me away, that there are now drugs being developed where single dosages are in the multi-millions of dollars. And I remember one of the first conversations you and I had together was about this vision you had of personalized medicine being a thing where at some point in the future we would all be pulling drugs out of our refrigerator, right? But means we're pulling them out of the refrigerator, right? They require, a cold chain to get them, to an individual and have kind of this personalized medicine. And I think this is just another example where, that ability to build and create drugs that have that very high cost is really only, something that's achievable through, at this point, largely a cold chain.
Absolutely. And again, I think when you look at the entire cold chain and supply of pharmaceuticals and other trends that is aligned with this, like home hospitalization and just that the market is actually expanding. When you look at so intolerant types of pharmaceuticals like this, because they're typically being distributed at negative 70 or 80, or at least in cold storage, right? Then they demand so much attention and they're so valuable. So the entire kind of commercial model for many of the logistic companies is going to be changed. The entire speed of which these companies, they need to develop these pharmaceuticals is increasing. We're seeing in the United Kingdom right now that we're seeing a change to the clinical trial methodologies that allows these types of medicine to be run through different types of clinical trials. So you see kind of a change on the government, like on the regulatory side. You're seeing a change in the supply chain, and with all that in mind, and you pilot together, I can't see another future that is actually not where we need to consider that the patient needs to be a lot more involved in all of this. And I believe like the thing that I really install into all employees in Eupry is that our goal is right now to be able to mimic the high fantastic quality we see in the top pharmaceutical companies. We need to mimic that all across the supply chain, both before and after. And yes, we are gonna figure out new commercial models to do that. Yes, we need to innovate. Yes, we need to adapt to the needs that you have there, because the supply chain is just gonna change and revamp so much because of these types of pharmaceuticals that are so much better than small molecule, in some cases at least. I'm sorry, I'm probably taking my mouth too full there.
No, and I think going a step further, we've kind of talked about cold chain or temperature control as a general topic at this point, but also with the variety of drugs being developed, the variety of cold environments that are required is just expanding and expanding. And so part of Eupry's strength here, and Adam, you could probably talk about this as the development or expansion of being able to plug in new sensors and just find different ways to use Eupry's technology to adapt to different environments along the kind of continuum of cold chain, because the things that work in a 0 degree Celsius environment and the things that work in a negative 80 environment are very, very different, and that just poses some really fundamental problems. And I don't want to just like blanket talk about cold chain and not get into the fact that like there's some very real, just like physics and chemistry questions that have to be answered just to manage environments like this. Never mind be able to like actually track and monitor, hyper cold cryo type environments moving ahead.
Basically, what you're posing is that the work in the labs, the work in the CDMOs is also going to be affected by this. The handling of these kind of material is going to be affected. And then now we are down to the physics and the actual like the products. Like we've had to change, things like cabling, things like the types of sensors in our equipment in order to accommodate these trends. As an example, we've had to change our internal calibration laboratory setup. We've had to change the way that we supply our goods out to our customers to be ready for this change, as an example.
Yeah, I think we've already talked some about the specialization or personalization of these drugs, but as you continue to see, kind of drug development be personalized, there's just more and more money flowing into this space, more and more demands on the supply chain, and then more and more niche and hyper niche, specific drugs being developed here. So across the board, we're seeing demands on the cold chain grow, and we'll come back to this as kind of these three topics come together. But let's jump ahead a little bit to the onshoring of the U.S. Pharma manufacturing sector. And so, we don't want to spend too much time on tariffs and whatnot, but we know that's been a part of things this year. But there are also just, a variety of new things happening across the supply chain that are requiring, things to be U.S. centric. And I think the first of those is that there's a lot of drug development has always happened in the U.S., right? But a lot of that drug development is supplied by raw materials that are actually coming to us from Asia, right? And so as soon as you start producing things that require those, ingredients, you now have a cold chain that has to pull from the Asian continent and make it here in a compliant fashion for them to be kind of manufactured in the US as we look ahead. So as we continue kind of the drug development that's always happened in the US, we are increasingly having to find ways to be supported by supply chains that are temperature controlled and in many cases looking to Asia for those raw materials.
As a foreigner in the States today, I'm so proud to be here. It's been such an incredible welcoming that I have gone. So now we're not talking the specifics, but me coming here, because right now in the time we are at, I think it's important to note at least that here in North Carolina and here in the US, my company has been received in a way that has been absolutely extraordinary. It's funny to see a number like this, right? Because we see a general kind of onshoring trend from various different industries, and also here in the States. And we see that in many ways, actually, with some of our customers really opening up a lot of new plants and a lot of new sites to accommodate this onshoring trend. We are there to accommodate it. But I think it also proves, again, back to this specific stat, that the world of pharmaceuticals is really interconnected with not only innovation like what comes right now, in this case from Europe to US, but most likely also verse the other way around. I hope to carry so much innovation and companies with me out in the world too, because there's so many great things happening in the States right now that I believe has relevance in so many other markets. Among other, the drugs that are being developed here has to be carried out and distributed and being able to be distributed in the rest of the world, not only Europe, but also other parts. I see that as a really important part of my quest. We need to cooperate, and there's so much opportunity. One of the things that we've seen in Eupry is that the many American companies we're working with, that we can help them to harmonize their quality operations in the rest of the globe. And that's just a funky little thing, right? Because we are talking a lot about onshoring, but the rest of the world are actually utilizing a lot of those fantastic drugs that are being developed here. And we just feel it again in our operations when companies, they have a CDMO site. There are 2 sites located here on the East Coast, and then they have one in Portugal, one in India, and they want to harmonize that. Well, it's a fine, I would say, example of how the world is connected within pharmaceuticals. And this is an example, of how it is inevitably interconnected, right?
Inevitably interconnected. And I think, as much as drug development may be kind of reshored or manufacturing may be reshored, we're taking, the raw ingredients, the APIs that are coming, into that development process from other places. So even though the actual manufacturing may be happening here, by no way is the supply chain simplified. And I think, as the U.S. market continues to grow, and we carry drugs that are manufactured all the way down to the pharmacy level, or in some cases to the patient themselves, with cold requirements, we're seeing kind of 2 sides of that supply chain, right? So raw materials coming into U.S. manufacturers, and then, from that manufacturer, delivered almost to your door with some level of cold requirements now. And I think GLP-1s are the ones that, we all know or hear about, but it's happening across the board. And I think, that was a big aha moment for me in stepping in with Eupry, where there's a lot of logistics work going on, but you almost have to break logistics up into two different ways of thinking about it, right? Inbound raw materials and then finished product out the door. And there's two different logistical processes going there with different size and scale and requirements.
That's really interesting. Like what other, I'm really curious about that actually, David, now, because one thing is me talking about almost my, I don't know, the family part of me moving in the personal side and watching this fantastic market evolve in front of me. What is it that you've kind of since like a year from now, besides the stats, like coming into Eupry and a company like this?
Yeah, I think the international nature is kind of an obvious one. And last week we were at Interfex, and just wandering around a show like that, you realize there are people from all over the world supporting all different types of businesses with all different types of solutions, whether they be logistical or drug development or distribution. So like very much, I don't know if there is an industry that we are all in it together as much as the pharmaceutical or healthcare world. And I think that's very clear. But also like the variety of use cases, right? And I came in with some background in logistics and was able to kind of jump in and say, oh, cool, I understand what we're doing over here with shipping containers. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. And maybe we're bringing raw materials on a boat from that shipping container. Well, then you see we have another shipping container use case, which is really a storage facility that's being used, in kind of last mile delivery in another use case. And so like they're both shipping containers, but the use case and like how those are actually fitting into the supply chain is so different that like really zooming out and understanding like what are the requirements for all of us to have access to these drugs in the future, and what has to happen in terms of the physical world to develop that full supply chain is kind of mind-bogglingly complex. And I think that's one of the really fun parts about stepping into this world. And another part that like you look at the opportunities and the people coming up with really innovative solutions, it's been kind of mind-blowing to see. And that's a really cool combination of kind of bigger companies like we highlighted on that initial slide that maybe and understand from logistics and kind of global movement in one way or the other, and then some really cool startup or more innovative things that are solving problems there as well. So yeah, it's just a really fun, really dynamic, and sometimes overwhelming space to be in.
Thank you. That's cool.
So we'll jump ahead to the third of these topics now, and I think this is one that always made sense to me. And from the time that I was kind of introduced to Eupry, I always thought of it as like the modern way we should be doing things, right? I have a Nest thermostat in my house and know what temperature it is on my phone with that. Like, why don't we have this everywhere, right? And there's some very real requirements that we have to meet in the pharmaceutical world to kind of mimic that functionality. But I think technology and technology requirements across the board are evolving, and we may be at a bit of an inflection point there as well to say.
I just love that analogy.
Yeah.
I really love it. Like, why would anybody out there listening to this webinar kind of accept the fact that, when they have a Nest thermostat in their own house and they can watch everything on their phone at the same time as they're watching NBA, why would they expect something that is not that anymore, right? So it's almost like a wake-up call for us in the industry to just like, we have to perform on those things too.
Yeah, and I can't take credit for that analogy. I inherited that from someone I was introducing Eupry to, and they're like, yeah, I have that at my house, and like what's in the warehouse is worth a whole lot more than what's in my house, so we should probably have a digital component there as well. But I think the important piece there is, Adam mentioned before, kind of AI and compliance being oil and water. Like, we have to make sure that the technology that we're implementing can meet the requirements that exist, right? And it's always kind of cool and innovative and AI-driven stuff that gets a lot of the headlines, but we don't want to sacrifice the requirements that we have. And the standards that exist in order to do things digitally, right? That's not a trade we're looking to make. But I think as I walked into Eupry and into many of these regulated conversations, it was actually really interesting to see that the idea of Pharma 4.0 and continuous monitoring and these standards had actually existed for some time. And so maybe just take a minute and talk about like the history of some of those requirements, and like it may seem like we're ready to do some of these things now, but in many ways, it's not new.
No, I've kind of like over just the few years that I have been in the industry since 12, I've seen kind of a waterfall of regulatory demand. Well, one thing is that overall you see this kind of the regulation, the adoption of regulation is being pushed from a point of the pharmaceutical production out into the supply chain and into the clinical trial in the pre the part of it, but also the supply chain before as part of the API. But it's kind of like derived from the regulatory side within the manufacturing side. So over a course of, I think, 5 years, I saw that in, let's say, pharmacies, they didn't have a requirement for, let's say, monitoring 10 years ago. But suddenly they had a requirement for monitoring. They had to move away from just a sensor or data logger kind of approach. Now they had to monitor. And then suddenly they also had to make sort of like just a justification of using, let's say, a fridge or a warehouse. So like it's mimicking a validation to actually being a real validation. So there's this kind of waterfall of regulatory demand that is slowly sifting out. It's not like the regulatory is not actually written up. It's pretty clear the GDP, it kind of defines it, and it's stated, but the adoption of it is not there. And it's because it's not actually practiced. There's nobody actually going out regulating it. So, and this is coming more and more and more. And that's the kind of adoption that this waterfall that is sifting through the entire supply chain, both back and forth, that we just have to expect. And technology is part of that, because when at one point we came with this, the mapping kits that we're using for doing like simple validations, where you could do it yourself suddenly. It's a wireless data logger that you can use, and there's software, and it basically does everything for you in these cases. And when we simplified and we cost reduced it in a way so it could actually be justified even out there, I think this is a really good example of how at least we use technology and kind of wrapped it up in a different way to make use of it in a setting that wasn't actually a market. Like it was just something that appeared because now there was a regulatory adoption of it.
No, I think that's spot on, and I think it's a really good way to think about technology as a way to expand a total market. And I think if we go back to the idea of AI, like AI isn't going to take everyone's job in compliance, right? We're going to find new uses that then need to be adapted to. And I just think about my time here, and like we're talking to truck drivers about validating trailers. We're talking to pop-ups and inflatables as validated spaces. We're talking about compounding pharmacies as having a cold component. Like all of this requires adaptation, but all of that, like standardization and all of the experience out there, really comes from pharma and the big pharma folks who have met these requirements for a long time. And what's happening is everybody else throughout that supply chain and distribution process is really having to live up to the same requirements, which will keep all of us busy, I imagine, for some time.
Yeah, and you see that. So that's one end of the spectrum, right? Where you can use technology in a way to kind of like, I would say, open new pockets of opportunities and where to validate the entire supply chain. But you also see it in the very depth of manufacturing with concept that is actually quite old, like continuous validation is a concept that has, like, if I remember correctly, 5 or 10 years from a regulatory standpoint, but it couldn't be adapted really, or at least we didn't really see it up until now. And I think, again, the reason why we suddenly start to see it is because, at least from our vantage point, we started pushing with, the operational power of Eupry and the digitization of all our processes kind of led to now we can suddenly distribute a lot more, let's say, sensors at a lower cost. Like as simple as that. But what it causes is that we can just let them stay in a room, in an incubator, in in whatever setting in an actual production line, we can let it stay in there, and we can let it, continuously validate the state of it, because we can easily calibrate it. We can do all the things. I think the point that I'm going to take here is that you see it across the entire board. It's not only in these kind of like end of the supply chain, it's also within the actual manufacturing. And what it helps, I would say, as the technology in itself, it proves at least that you can find ways to optimize compliance in a way that is by digitizing, by automating, and in time, because of that data, you will be able to leverage AI. And then suddenly, instead of having a human to activate all those operations, then you can have automations to run it, and then AI to pull out some information that is important for the human in the loop to react upon. So it's not actually going in and performing compliance, but it's acting as this kind of input to the people that's performing compliance, inherently making it much more effective. So I think that's what you can expect all around you, is that I really don't believe that AI will replace the human as the compliance piece, because it's not like AI doesn't operate that way. It's statistical, so it has like reasoning behind taking a choice, but that's not what you do in compliance. It's a binary. Has this passed? Is this checklist done? Then it's compliant. And we need to keep it that way, I believe. But we just need to figure out ways to make us efficient while working with AI. And there you have a ton of opportunities within pharma. The big problem is just that many other industries doesn't have this adaptation, this kind of thought about compliance, at least, because you see, let's say the food and manufacturing and beverage industry, it's AIing the world. It's so incredible what they're empowering with right now. But the compliance aspect of things, the documentation practice, and the way of working is just different. The reasoning behind it is different, at least. So we need to respect pharmaceutical compliance. But I think with examples like what we are doing, digitizing and taking this road and automating, that will be able to leverage AI also within compliance. Because the burden for a pharmaceutical company within compliance is actually rather substantial. So in order for us to keep on developing at the pace that we're seeing right now, I think it's inevitable that we need our compliance officers to become, I would say, more efficient by the use of AI, but not compromising compliance.
Yeah, and I think the best conversations we have are ones where, compliance or risk and these factors are, a partner in that process and not coming in at the end, because
Yes.
We're talking about the very upside of technology right now. The downside is like there's an enforcement spike happening right now. Right, there's a surge in kind of letters that people are receiving from the FDA and not being in compliance because maybe they did take a risk or digitize something new, or maybe just haven't matured processes. And when you're caught on those things, there's a lot of risk to just the performance of a facility, to your ability to meet commercial standards and requirements, and just to distract your team in that process. And so I think the ability to not only see the future and say, hey, what do we do to prepare for this? But also right now we're seeing a very real set of audit requirements and FDA taking note that hey, there are a lot of drugs moving in a new way here. The requirements for that are new and different, and not everybody is keeping up to this change. And there's very reactive times where we hear from people post audit or going into an audit, and they're saying hey, I'm really worried about how this is going to go.
Yeah, I had a conversation yesterday with a gentleman here from Raleigh, David, who said something really, really fantastic. And he said so he converted his entire company being AI first. That's a completely different industry, but something that struck me as interesting was, he said the only way you can apply AI in his company as an operational kind of element was that he had really, really well-defined workflows, because AI really doesn't work with the ambiguity in operating. And when you look at it from an outside in, what is the industry in the world that is protocolized to an extent that is insane? Well, that is this industry. What is the industry that has, I would say, the most well-educated staff across any role in the entire, I would say, staffing outlet of a company? That is this industry. So I think to some extent, if you take compliance out and really just handle it from that vantage point and respect that there is no way out of I would say, compromising compliance, because we will never be able to deliver the drugs that we need to, particularly not the new and critical ones within the groups that we've just been talking about here. There's no way out of not respecting that and even just really dialing in on it. But all the surrounding pieces is already there, like super well-educated people, very protocolized operations. This is pharma. So I think there's a massive opportunity for pharma, both on the manufacturing side before and after, and also the logistics side, for actually adopting compliance, but it has to respect compliance.
Yeah, and so I want to close stats wise on this really great call out, which is also kind of compliance oriented, but goes into logistics specifically. And we've talked a little bit about logistics and supply chain throughout this conversation, but I want to talk technology and not necessarily AI, but like connectivity, because as these supply chains grow and as requirements change there, people want visibility to what's happening, not just like with your Nest in your, spare bedroom or whatever, but as things move across these supply chains. And that takes a level of connectivity that we have in a lot of other parts of our life. But when you go look at, logistics providers who are, now, being asked to meet these requirements, right, of validated environments and maintaining temperatures and executing protocols that maybe, as a logistics company, you haven't had to deal with before in pharma handling, there are a whole bunch of additional connectivity requirements on the technology side there. I think Eupry being kind of digitally based, but also battery oriented, wireless, like allows us to meet some of those requirements. So just take a second there and double us back to AI is obviously big, technology in general is big, but like being connected and just having visibility to what's happening across, either multiple sites or a supply chain is something that Eupry has always done, but I think has become particularly valuable in the last year or so.
Yeah, no, it's like we've been through, I would say, 10 years of data gathering. Everybody has been talking about data, right? It was like, we need more data points. We just need more and more and more. And then you had all these massive data points, and some of it were even live. And then you were just like, oh no, what do I do now? That was kind of like the reality of the last 10 years almost, right?
Well, the blessing of connectivity and constant, like monitoring is now you have all the data. What do you do with it?
And it was the solution to everything, right? Yeah. It was just like, get more data. And then you realize, oh my God, what do I do about it? Because you suddenly had transparency into so many new elements of this entire chain of events. Who is going to do anything about it? Like, we need new roles to actually manage that. So again, coming back to we have that visibility. Actually, it's out there. We can supply with connectivity in all these different aspects, and we can get inputs and we can do whatever. But now we need to train ourselves to utilize this information in order to avoid, warning letters, as an example, right? In order to avoid compliance mistakes and deviations and nonconformities, we need to do that. Again, coming back to AI, because simply we don't have hands enough to do that. With this onshoring that is happening right now, it's not only hands, it's intellect. And we need more of the people that has that intellect. That's coming back again to the reasoning that I did before with compliance. Like the best compliance officers out there, the best quality people and operators out there, we need more of their intellect. That's why I think AI has a reason to elevate ourselves. I felt it on my own, just, utilizing AI in all sort of different things. Like I love being close to my employees in Eupry, but adding all these different management layers, it's just hard for me to get down on the ground and actually talk with people, my people and customers. And AI has been a massive kind of like implementation just for me in order to get close to the real, I'd say, challenges or opportunities, and not just layering in managers who can filter that information to me. I don't know if it's that, taking another talk into it, but it's again like, I think the best people often ends up in a position where they're not actually close to the most important problems. And there I believe that AI can be part of it still, being able to accommodate much, much higher compliance standards and utilizing and creating new ways of distributing and creating medicine. Because obviously we're talking about AI in creating medicine and AI in photo recognition of cells, etc. That makes a ton of sense, and that has its own problems. But here we have an operational thing where we can enhance our work so substantially. Because what happens now, back to your question, because what happens is that when you have all these like uniquely designed types of drugs out there that has to go into a unique distribution chain, it's not anymore this kind of bulk exercise where you just put a pallet on a plane and then it ends up somewhere. It's this one, two, three vials.
Yep.
And yes, right now we need to do like some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies. They are creating these sites in all regions. Well, the small cell and gene and biotech companies, they won't be able to do so. So the only good solution for them is getting bought up by the giants. Maybe commercially that makes sense, but maybe it doesn't. What about if you were able to actually handle that one vial and send it anywhere in the world? That's just an operational issue. But it's so complex right now because it's one vial and it's worth, it's invaluable. How do you do that? Isn't that just the operational issue that we're going to solve? And we're going to solve it whatever mean we have to get it out there to the person anywhere in the world who needs that vial.
Yeah. And I think that level of transparency, I think that was maybe the thing that surprised me in joining Eupry and having a lot of these conversations is I kind of expected a lot of, whether it be the logistics providers or, manufacturers or whatever, to have this control room. Like I always think of like the NASA, big wall of TVs with like, here's where everything's going and how everything's performing. And in many cases that doesn't exist yet. Right. And that is the future state that like once you do know logistically where, your individualized vials are moving around the world, you have a ton more information, a ton more to manage. And, you need transparency to that process. And so I think, technology kind of looking ahead, like where are we headed? Probably to some version of like a NASA style control room of like, what are all the operations that are happening, in both the inbound and outbound of the drugs that are moving through our supply chain. And like, in some ways that seems like something that was in like, a space movie 10 or 20 years ago, but also like we still have to build in this industry.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good example. And I think that's really our job to make that a NASA, that NASA kind of control room kind of analogy, to make it work and even just figure out a way to let normal people in this industry actually manage that. That's exactly what we are working on with some of our biggest clients, at least, because they typically have it extrapolated in so complex situations that they need to be able to have comfort in their own operations, even though it's happening across, 50 different sites around the world with hundreds of people operating it. How can you kind of consolidate all that with all that transparency you suddenly have? Again, coming back to, you can deliver all the data in the world, but how do you point out the really important pieces to focus on? That's the control room kind of setting that we're building for some of our clients that is obviously on the bigger end of scale. But don't ever forget the small clients, because I really believe this is where the innovation comes from. This is from the universities. How can we make sure that these companies, they really get out there and not because that's basically what we see in our kind of pipeline of not only roadmap, product development, but also just in the pipeline of companies coming in all the time.
Great. So we're going to wrap up here. If you guys kind of watching and participating want to add questions to the speaker chat, feel free to go ahead and do so. We'll come back to them in just a minute or two here. But really, there's a common thread kind of through all of these conversations, which is that the cold chain is expanding, the requirements are expanding. The pipeline is growing. Like those are all great things, right? And those changes are breeding opportunities, right? For all kinds of companies, big and small. And the compliance standards in many cases have been talking about things like continuous monitoring and digital for a while, but the compliance model, actually living that, making it real, hasn't necessarily kept up, right? And so as we continue to innovate, as we continue to, improve the world in many cases in, terms of delivering these outcomes, we have to adapt. And that's hard in many cases, right? To do things differently. And so I think all three of these, challenges that we've talked about, just the growing, evolving pipeline, the cold chain that's there, and then actually utilizing the right parts of the technology that in many cases have existed for a number of years, kind of sums this all up as, things are changing in a very positive way. And we need to make sure that not only the compliance standards, but the model itself, like how we operate, has to keep up.
Yeah, that's a really good example.
So 3 ways that U.S. companies are responding to these changes. The moving from kind of hardware ownership to more kind of lean models of handling the tools that you use every day, whether that be actual product lines or manufacturing lines. But I think finding ways to like buy differently. Not everything is a CapEx anymore when you think about these new investments and new things moving into the market. And maybe just pause on that one and talk about Eupry as an offering in the market. And we hear this sometimes, like, do people buy stuff from Eupry? Do they rent it? Like what is the value of providing any service, not necessarily what we provide, and how does somebody think about buying that from us versus renting or leasing or any other model commercially?
Yeah, I've believed ever since I started and I went to Ethiopia to put up my proud designed hardware pieces that could monitor temperature and humidity in a rural setting in Ethiopia. I went down there, I was so proud of myself, right? And then I put it up, it was working, went back to Denmark, we could monitor it, it was like, and I realized they didn't care about the hardware. And it was so kind of demoralizing almost, because it was like, what? Why don't you love this?
Right. Isn't this cool?
Isn't this cool? Probably I had too high hopes on it, but I realized it wasn't about the hardware. It was about getting the job done. And the job wasn't just being done with that extra additional piece of hardware that they, by the way, had, 8 different versions of, old dials, etc., with, the temperature
recording,
recording dial. That they had a few of them. But it was like, and I realized it's not about that. It's not about the hardware. It's not like the hardware doesn't do a part in this, but it was about getting the job done, which was these people want to get through to an audit. They want to be able to sit there and be confident in how you handle their compliance and quality. And that's the job that needs to get done. And when you then look at, okay, how can I manage that? How can I help them with that? That kind of became the reasoning behind getting this entire supply chain to work in a different way. And I realized that at least, so it doesn't kind of make sense to sell that device. It makes sense for me to somehow charge for getting that job done. And that's what I'm vouching for. Like I believe that what we need to do is put our head on the chopping block and say, hey, we are here to help you get the job done. If you can find somebody else to get the job done, then go pick them. And that's why I believe in the model, at least in Eupry, where it was more about just lease and get the service you need, and then you can figure out if you can find it another way or do it in your own way. But until that point, let me just help you get the job done. So yes, we've always been, I don't know what you want to call it, we've just been leasing or we've just been servicing. We give our hardware for free. It's just part of, let's say if you have a unit, if you have a truck, if you have an incubator, a chamber, a production line, how many units, devices, whatever do you need? That unit is going to cost you this amount of money. And then I'm going to calibrate, I'm going to make it, I'm going to validate it, I'm going to put people on ground, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make that job done so you can do what you're best at. That's kind of the model that I've believed in. And I think there are, again, with times that are changing and financial dynamics that are right now all again up in the air, I think it's a balance all the time. But I really believe that at least what we're seeing, the success that we are having, is that the market is responding pretty well to it. Another piece is also that we're looking at a future that is dynamic, and this kind of like need to be dynamic is kind of like the contrary of buying a piece of hardware, where you may actually end up in a situation where it's like, It's actually wrong. I need something else tomorrow. I need to be flexible. I need 10 new of these units, or I need 15 of those and not 10 of those, so I need to get them away. And then you just ended up buying those equipment. It doesn't drive any revenue for you to own it. It doesn't drive the cost of where you're at. So I believe in a different model, and that's what kind of like has been our success, because it also, I would say, forces us to be on the forefront of innovation. Like, we have to just deliver that 5-star rating, else our customers won't be there.
Right, we find someone else.
Yeah, we're not doing the job. So I think that's been kind of an important piece in our model, making sure we just get the job done and get the real pragmatic news from our customers. Did we do that?
Awesome. And we're coming up on time here, so I'm going to skip us over the second one. We've talked a lot about continuous as an idea, and Pharma 4.0 and ISP standards and those types of things. There's plenty more there, but the last kind of item here that I have seen just over the time that I have been here is that in order to take advantage of AI, in order to have access to the performance of your facility on your phone, the underlying requirement there is that companies have to be putting their data and pulling all of their operational work into the cloud, right? And we haven't said the word cloud in this conversation yet, but like the prerequisite to doing all of that is leveraging the cloud. And I think we continue to see companies invest in moving things off-prem, getting things into the cloud, getting tools to integrate. It isn't just paperless as an idea anymore. It's like we need this data, we need our operations in a place that allows us as a multi-site or somebody who's part of a broader supply chain to be able to understand what's happening, not just in this facility, but in terms of what comes in and out of this facility. And that all starts with like cloud access. And there's still some kind of surprised eyes when you say, hey, I can show you what I do right here on my phone. And people are like, really? But I think that underlies all the things we've talked about, whether it be AI, the NASA control room view or whatever else. And I think, I've seen that adoption, pick up just in my short time here.
Oh yeah, there are so many. Again, like I typically tend to say that Eupry is working in 3-4 different industry segments. Like we are running a calibration company, we're running a validation company, and we're running an operational monitoring company. It's actually 3 different kind of like scientific areas in itself. And when you then have all these elements, and right now the reality is that they are broken out. So whenever you have this getting this job done out there, it's 4 different or 3 different companies at least getting in and assisting with getting this job done. And now it's not cloud-based. It's in some cases it's manual. It's on paper. And then you need to consolidate that. You need to walk into an audit. You need to prepare for that. So that's just the nature of it. And I think one of the opening lines is there. How can you piece them together? Okay, first of it's getting them into one system. It's cloud-basing it, and that's been natural for us to really just focus on that as a starting point before you can even digitize that, for us at least. Because it allowed us to create new, like we took a patent on a way to calibrate that was only possible because of that. And it's just the first, because there are so many opportunities when you start consolidating the workflows between those scientific industries. And I think cloud is just an important piece of it. So again, coming back to how can we get the job done? Well, it's just easier that way. Does it have to be compliant? Absolutely, yes. And we have to be so upfront with it that whenever we have this kind of concern, which is natural, it makes sense that you're concerned about getting your data in somebody else's hands and authority. How can you then secure that? Luckily, in this industry, we are so used to talk compliance. We're so used to argue and deal with protocols and this kind of compliance. So it's very natural for the companies to go in and assess. So how do you actually do it? Which is I would say a powerful marker in this industry in general. And there's so many aspects of this industry that I believe in the future will be copied out to many other industries. If we can really make it efficient, then it's just following normal scientific behaviors. Like I say to everybody who I hire in Eupry, who is probably not from the industry, there's nothing of what we do that is not logical. Like it all follows a very, very logical pattern. as kind of adopting the scientific methods. So we just want to make it more efficient.
I think that's a good place to leave it. We will jump over to a quick question or two here. We're a little past time. So I'm going to just summarize a couple of these together. First, and maybe we can bundle this all into one question, which is, you've spent a year here in the US. You coupled that with a lot of experience in this industry. What do we expect for next year?
For the next year in Eupry, we are again changing our software outlet. We did a fantastic hire on our new CTO, and he's completely just scaling up our development engine. So basically, there are so many things in our offerings online that is going to be enhanced, and we see that already with the new version of our validation and mapping tools that is going to be updated, and the first version already came out here after 1 month of his being present in the company. That's pretty wild, because there are things just in the software where there's so many opportunities. So I can keep on the roadmap. You will see new sensors. There's screen data logger coming up from Eupry. There is new types of calibration being included. We even saw a funny thing, actually, that with AI and with all these kind of like new brilliant people that we hire, they come in with this tool stack that is so beautiful. And we had one rep, he just developed his own really tiny tool to speed up report writing. And it was just so intuitive and so bright. And I think that's a general trend that you see. If you can still kind of adapt these kind of ways of working and validating software, etc., well, you can make that happen out there in the front end. People who is normally doing validations, they're suddenly developing tools and software. It's just like, think about that. That's a completely new way of working. So generally, in Eupry, you will see that. Another thing you will see is that we will spread our wings. We are hiring in major clusters throughout the United States. So we see a bigger presence of our people basically everywhere. And that's huge, in my opinion. And it's just leading the future, I would say, for this. And it leaves, I would say, a foundation also for us to continue our development in the coming years, because right now it's very incremental, actually. It's just making what we already know better. But we have some concepts in mind that is mind-boggling, and is about acquiring other companies, as an example, in order to figure out a way to get the job done in an even brighter and larger context. So I think that's kind of like the mindset that everybody can expect from Eupry, that we really want to lean in to this, getting the job done, really.
Yeah.
Doing whatever it takes.
Awesome place to leave it. Adam, thanks for the time. Audience, thanks for hanging with us for an hour or so here. We appreciate your questions, your comments along the way. And look on our webinar page for the next webinar coming up. It unfortunately will not have us as your wonderful hosts, but you will likely have continued opportunity to see more and more great content from our team looking ahead. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Bye.